Unfortunately, many Americans live on the outskirts of hope. Some because of their poverty, and some because of their color, and all too many because of both. Our task is to help replace their despair with opportunity. And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
That was Lyndon Johnson 50 years ago declaring a war on poverty. With us now from Washington, Republican Senator from Ohio, Rob Portman, who's revealed his ideas for a conservative plan to take on poverty. Thank you so much, Rob, for being with us. What is, we thought it was an either or. You have to be Republican or you have to fight against poverty. What are your plans? Paul Ryan's been talking about a focus on poverty too. What are we willing to do to help in this area?
Well, first, just the opposite from either or. Lyndon Johnson just talked about opportunity rather than despair. So, I mean, you look at the economy today, Joe, we're clearly in a point of despair in the sense that poverty is up. The rate of poverty is up, 47 million people below the poverty line. We also have a historically weak economy coming out of a recession. The recovery is not adding hope and opportunity to the middle class as well as people under the poverty line. So the question is, what do we do about it? I think there's two major things. One is we need a growth agenda, and you and I have talked a lot about that, and this includes, I think, transforming all of the institutions of our economy, from our healthcare system to our tax code, regulations, and so on. That's what JFK talked about a few years before this, which is a rising tide lifts all boats. But second, even in a rising tide, people are going to fall between the cracks. Some boats are going to end up landing on the shoals, and that's why I talked yesterday about some of the approaches that have worked. I talked about drug addiction and some of the approaches to that, stopping the war on drugs, but instead dealing with prevention and treatment and recovery. I talked about prisoner reentry, some of the models there. 2 decades ago, you and I worked on this issue of drug abuse from a Republican perspective, but also a bipartisan perspective. I've done this also with regard to prisoner reentry with Second Chance. So my point is there are ways to get at this. I call it constructive conservatism because we kind of know what works.
Right. Well, Rob, let me ask you this. So obviously, I mean, if we're just talking about, I'm not saying you're talking about this, I'm just pressing you a little bit here. If you came out and said, I've got a plan to take on poverty, and you talk about tax cuts, regulatory reform, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, a lot of people are going to roll their eyes and say, well, that's the Republican Party that we've been hearing about for 50 years. There has to be a spending component to it if you're going to get people's attention. Are you and other Republicans willing to invest in some of these programs to make a difference?
Yeah, I think we do. We invest in what works. What I talked about yesterday, Joe, is the fact that we should use federal funds to leverage local and nonprofit private funds. This has happened with regard to the drug issue. The example I used was this legislation that was passed 2 decades ago that I authored that talks about how to get community coalitions started. It turns out there was like 5,000 community coalitions that have been spawned from the Drug-Free Communities Act. This was federal funding, but it has to be matched 100% at the local level. It involves the whole community coming together. The problem is not going to be solved in Washington. Right. It's going to be a bottoms-up rather than a top-down approach. That's part of what I talked about. Also, evidence-based approaches. I talked about the Second Chance Act and the fact that it requires that you use the best practices, and the federal government has a big role to play there because some of the best research is done at the federal level. You can bring together best practices. If you go online, you can see the website on Second Chance. It's called What Works. Right. And that's an incredibly valuable role for the federal government.
Let's get to Gene Robinson. Gene Robinson with the Washington Post. Gene.
Senator Portman, good to talk with you. Does the Republican Party have any plans to address poor people, to try to communicate with poor people on these issues, and to try to sell a program that frankly does sound like what Republicans have been saying for a long time and what a lot of people think has not worked?
Yeah, no, look, I don't think Republicans have talked about this for a long time, Gene. I think what I said earlier about John Kennedy's admonition that a rising tide lifts all boats, we've talked a lot about that. We've talked about the fact that we need to grow the economy, create more jobs, and I think that's very important. But even in a growing economy, some people will be left behind. And I think we saw that in the 1980s, for instance. We saw a growing economy, and yet Ronald Reagan actually talked about how do you deal with people who have drug addiction problems, and therefore there are broken families, and therefore there are problems. And they need to get back to that. I specifically talked yesterday about the fact that you're not going to be able to deal with some of these broken communities until you deal with drug addiction and the impacts, particularly the impact that's disproportionate on poorer communities of the current war on drugs, which I don't think is working. And second, I talked about this issue of having record numbers of people in prison and us not dealing with them as they come out, 95% of whom are going to get out. That to me is a good conservative approach, because otherwise taxpayers are picking up the tab for a lot of people going back in and out of the system. Recidivism being about 2/3 of those people getting back in the system. There are ways to deal with these issues that are not traditionally viewed as Republican, but make a lot of sense.
Don't mean to cut you off. We got a lot of people who want to get at you, Rob. Here's Steve Ratner.
Senator, you made a couple references to President Kennedy's famous remark about a rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah.
But the fact was that President Kennedy thought the war on poverty was about a lot more than that. It was after his famous visit to West Virginia in 1960 that he in fact launched the war on poverty, launched food stamps, launched what became Head Start. And your party is in the process of trying to cut all those things. You yourself have voted against raising the minimum wage, which I know you think costs jobs, but which would actually raise, I think it's 4 or 5 million people out of poverty simply by getting them to $10.10 an hour. So what is wrong with those programs?
Steve, first of all, with regard to the minimum wage, as you talked about that, I strongly support programs that create jobs. I don't support raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour, a 40% increase over the next few years, because it's going to create fewer jobs. The issue with regard to poverty isn't the minimum wage, with all due respect, as much as it is about jobs. In fact, if you look at it, as you know, fewer than 0.3% of people are both on minimum wage and under the poverty line. Why? Because most people who are under the poverty line need a job. It's not about minimum wage, it's about a job. And the problem of raising the minimum wage too fast and too high is that you're going to result in fewer jobs. The Congressional Budget Office has joined with almost every other economic analysis I've seen to say if you do what the president is proposing, it will result in jobs being lost, not gained. So why not do things like the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, expanding that, making EITC work better, the Earned Income Tax Credit, things that actually directly affect work. So that's my alternative. I do support indexing minimum wage to inflation. That's what we do in Ohio. That works. I think states should be able to do that. All right. But I think we're getting off track on some of these political discussions. I know it's very popular, the minimum wage issue. Right. And again, Ohio's got a higher minimum wage and index to inflation. I support that, but it's not going to create more jobs.
Let's go to Mike Barnicle. Mike.
Senator, these are all admirable goals, but how do you attack poverty in this country when many members of your party have voted to cut food stamps, they've voted to repeal health care like 55 times. So you talk about a rising tide lifts all boats. How do you address a rising tide lifting a boat still filled with the hungry and the ill and those in ill health?
Yeah, Michael, just to be clear, I do believe that the rising tide theory is important. In fact, I think it's necessary. You've got to have a stronger economy. We have to have growth. And there are 5 or 6 things I think we should do immediately to get the economy moving again. We talked about the tax reform, regulatory relief. Dealing with healthcare costs, by the way, has to be one of those. In a competitive global economy, we've got to do a much better job really reforming all of our institutions of our economy, as other countries have done and we have not. But my point is that's not enough. It's necessary but not sufficient. You're still going to have people, as you say, who are left behind. And the question is, how do you come up with ways that are practical, I call it constructive, to actually look at what's worked and deal with these issues? I don't think it's going to happen from Washington alone. By the way, Lyndon Johnson said that later in that same speech you guys talked about, which is that this is not going to happen in Washington. This is going to happen in the field, as he said. He said it's going to happen in private homes. It's going to happen in public offices from the courthouse on up. So he even acknowledged this was not something that was going to happen just in Washington, but Washington has an important role to play. And that's what I tried to lay out in my speech yesterday.
All right. Rob, thank you so much for being with us. Senator Rob Portman, we appreciate it. Tomorrow morning.